The knock came at 2:17 in the morning, cutting through silence thick enough to choke on. James Harrison stood frozen at the entrance to his penthouse, one hand gripping the door frame, the other instinctively reaching for the Sig Sauer that hadn't left its safe in 3 years. Through the peephole, a woman, Asian features, mid-30s maybe, face swollen purple on one side, split lips still wet with blood, is darting behind her like something hunted her through the darkness. She wasn't supposed to be here. Nobody was. The Pearl District building had security that cost more per month than most people's mortgages, key card access, doormen who vetted guests like Secret Service agents. Yet here she stood, 28 floors up, desperate enough to find a way past all of it. The woman knocked again, harder this time, and whispered something that made his blood stop moving. Her voice carried through the steel door, cracked and breaking. "Please, they have my daughter." Jamie's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. 20 feet behind him, Emma slept in a bedroom larger than most studio apartments, dreaming innocent 8-year-old dreams he'd sworn on his wife's grave to protect. This stranger was dragging violence to his threshold, pulling the darkness he'd spent 3 years burying back into the light. But when he looked through that peephole one more time, he saw something that stripped away every defense he'd built. Not just terror in her eyes, though that was there, coming and immediate. Something else. Recognition of what comes after hope dies. The hollow understanding that this might be the last door she knocks on before the world takes everything. He'd seen that look before. Kabul, Helmand, a dozen other places where the geography changed but the desperation never did. The look of someone who knows death is close and closing fast. Jamie opened the door. She stumbled back half a step, surprised he'd actually answered. Surprised someone like him existed in the same universe as whatever hell she'd just escaped. Up close, the damage was worse. The bruise around her left eye spread into her temple, fresh enough that the swelling hadn't peaked yet. Dried blood crusted the corner of her mouth. Her nurse's scrubs, he noticed the Providence Portland logo on the chest pocket, were torn at the shoulder and her hands shook like she'd been running for miles. "I'm sorry." The words tumbled out fast. Too fast, like she'd rehearsed them 100 times on the way here and now couldn't stop. "I know it's late, I know this is crazy, but I saw you at the hospital last month during the board meeting, and I remembered the donation announcement, the new ER wing, and I thought maybe you'd understand. Maybe you'd be someone who could help." Jamie said nothing. His training screamed at him to shut the door, lock it, call building security, get between this woman and Emma. But his hands stayed frozen on the doorknob. 3 years of carefully constructed distance, of choosing safety over engagement, of being the kind of father who showed up instead of the kind who got people killed, all of it crumbling against one simple truth. She knew his name, knew where he lived, and that meant someone else did too. "My name is Diana Chen." She pulled in a shaking breath, steadied herself against the doorframe. "My daughter Sophie, she's 9 years old. They took her 6 hours ago when I got off my shift, grabbed us both outside the hospital parking garage, threw us in a van. They've been moving us around, keeping us separated. I got away when one of them got careless with a door lock. But Sophie's still there. They called an hour ago. $50,000 by 4 a.m. or they kill her." "Who are they?" The question came out rougher than Jamie intended, sharp enough that Diana flinched. But she didn't back down. Held his stare with something that looked like defiance mixed with exhaustion. "I don't know their names. 5, maybe 6 men. The one who called spoke Spanish, but his English was perfect. No accent. He knew things. Knew my address, knew Sophie's school, knew I worked nights at Providence. This wasn't random. They planned it." Jamie felt something cold settle in his chest, the tactical part of his brain clicking into operational mode before he could stop it. Targeted abduction. Specific ransom amount. Short timeline to prevent police mobilization. Either amateurs who watched too many movies or professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. "You need to call the FBI. They handle kidnappings." Diana's face crumpled. "There's no time. 4 a.m. is less than 2 hours from now. By the time the FBI sets up, runs their protocols, Sophie could be in another state. They said they're moving her at dawn. If I don't bring the money, I'll never see her again." She grabbed the door frame to steady herself, and Jamie saw the desperation crack through whatever composure she'd been holding on to. I saw your truck in the hospital parking lot once, black Ford Raptor with veteran plates. And during the board meeting, someone mentioned you were ex-military. Navy SEAL, they said. You know how to do things other people can't. Please, I have $3,000 in my account. That's it. No family within 2,000 miles. No one else to ask. I'm begging you. The words hit Jamie like a fist to the sternum. Navy SEAL. He hadn't been called that in 3 years. Not since the day he'd walked into his commanding officer's office in Coronado and put his trident on the desk. Not since Sarah's funeral, when his team had tried to present him with the flag and he'd left it on the casket because touching it meant accepting she was gone. He'd promised himself that day. No more violence, no more missions, no more becoming the thing Sarah had always feared he'd turn into if he stayed in too long. Just building his company, being present for Emma, fixing what he could fix without a gun in his hand. Living the kind of life where 8-year-old girls could grow up without knowing their father had killed men in 17 different countries. Without knowing he'd been the best at it until the day it stopped mattering. I can't help you. The words felt like gravel in his throat. Diana's face went white, all the blood draining until she looked like she might collapse right there in his doorway. I'm sorry about your daughter. I am. But you need to find someone else. Call the police and take your chances. Diana didn't move, just stood there, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks, and whispered the one question Jamie had been dreading since the moment he opened the door. If it was your daughter, would you wait for the police? The door stopped halfway closed. Jamie's hand was shaking now because he knew the answer. He'd known it the second she said the words, my daughter. If someone took Emma, he wouldn't wait for anyone. Wouldn't fill out forms or follow protocols or trust the system to move fast enough. He'd burn down the world and everyone in it to get her back. And God help anyone who stood in his way. Daddy, Jamie turned. Emma stood in the hallway in her unicorn pajamas, rubbing sleep from eyes that were too much like Sarah's, dark and wide, and seeing more than any child should. She looked so small in the darkness of the hallway, so breakable, and the sight of her punched the air from his lungs the way it did every time he remembered how close he'd come to losing her too. Sarah had been driving to pick him up from the airport. If he'd taken a different flight, caught an earlier connection, stayed one more day in Syria to finish the debrief, Sarah would still be alive. Emma would still have a mother. The math of loss never stopped calculating itself in his head, an endless equation that always came out wrong no matter how many times he ran it. Who's that? Emma's voice was quiet, cautious, the way it got when she sensed something was wrong but didn't have words for it yet. She looked past Jamie to Diana, took in the bruised face and split lip and the way this stranger was holding herself like something inside had broken. Just someone who needs directions. Jamie kept his voice soft, gentle, the tone he'd learned to use when Emma had nightmares about the car accident she was too young to remember clearly, but old enough to know had stolen her mother. Go back to bed, sweetheart. Emma didn't move. She looked at Diana's injuries, at the fear in her eyes, at the way she swayed slightly like she might fall over any second. Then Emma asked the question that destroyed Jamie's last defense. Daddy, what would Mom do? Jamie closed his eyes. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, clear as the day she'd said it, 3 weeks before the deployment that ended everything. They'd been arguing about his re-enlistment, about whether he should take another rotation. Sarah had been holding Emma, who was only 5 then, and she'd looked at him with those steady brown eyes that had always seen straight through every wall he tried to build. We save people, Jamie. That's what makes us human. But you have to decide what kind of saving matters more. The kind that happens overseas with people you'll never see again. Or the kind that happens when you're here for your daughter every single day, showing her what it means to choose love over duty. He'd chosen wrong, taken the deployment. And Sarah had died waiting for him to come home, killed by a drunk driver who walked away with a broken arm while she bled out on the interstate. Go back to bed, Holly. Emma's real name slipped out, the name he only used when his mind was somewhere else, fighting old battles. She noticed, recognized the tone that meant his thoughts had gone to dark places she couldn't follow. But she didn't argue, just looked at Diana one more time, something passing between them that Jamie didn't understand, before padding back down the hallway. Jamie waited until he heard her door click shut before turning back to Diana. His jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. How many are there? Diana's eyes went wide, hope and disbelief fighting for control of her expression. You'll help? How many? 6 that I saw, maybe more. They have guns, pistols on their hips. 2 of them had bigger weapons, rifles with straps. They kept us in different rooms. Sophie was in the back. I could hear her crying through the walls. They moved us twice in the van, kept us blindfolded until we got to the second location. That's where I escaped. Jamie ran the numbers. 6 armed men, possibly more. Unknown facility with multiple rooms, meaning they had space and planning. Child hostage, high-stress situation with a tight deadline. 2 hours until the window closed. It was a suicide run dressed up as a rescue mission, the kind that got people killed when variables went sideways. But he'd run 50 of them, maybe more. He'd lost count somewhere between Kabul and Mosul, all those late-night extractions bleeding together into one long memory of darkness and gunfire and the weight of other people's lives in his hands. And despite everything, despite every promise he'd made to Sarah's memory and Emma's future, he still remembered how. I need 10 minutes. Wait here. He didn't wait for her response. Walked back through the penthouse, past Emma's room where he could hear her breathing, soft and steady, into his bedroom at the far end of the hall. The closet smelled like cedar and expensive fabric, suits from Savile Row he wore to board meetings, Italian shoes he'd paid more for than some people's monthly rent. He pushed past all of it to the back corner, where a biometric safe sat hidden behind winter coats Sarah had bought him that he'd never worn. His thumb against the scanner. Sarah's birthday in the keypad, April 18th, 22. The lock clicked open with a hiss of pressurized air. The Sig Sauer peachy sat in its foam cradle exactly where he'd left it 3 years ago, oil black and waiting. Jamie lifted it, felt the familiar weight settle into his palm like shaking hands with an old friend he'd sworn never to see again. Muscle memory took over. He checked the chamber, loaded the magazine, chambered around with a slide pull that was too smooth, too practiced, too much like coming home to a house that was burning down. 15 rounds. He had 3 more magazines in the bottom of the safe. 60 rounds total, more than enough for 6 targets if his aim was still good. Nowhere near enough if it wasn't. He found the tactical vest buried under old photographs he couldn't look at. Sarah smiling on their wedding day, Cannon Beach behind her, wind in her hair. Sarah holding newborn Emma in the hospital, exhausted and radiant and alive. Sarah at Emma's 5th birthday party, 3 weeks before the deployment. 3 weeks before Jamie made the choice that killed her. He shoved the photos aside. Pulled on the vest. It fit looser than it used to, the Kevlar panels hanging differently on a frame that had softened during 3 years of board meetings and conference calls instead of daily PT and combat ops. His body had adapted to civilian life even as his nightmares stayed sharp, brutal, immediate. In the bathroom mirror, Jamie barely recognized himself. The man staring back had Sarah's death carved into every line of his face. 3 years of grief and guilt and trying to be someone his daughter wouldn't be afraid of. But underneath that, the seal was still there. Cold, efficient, ready to do terrible things for the right reasons. He grabbed a black jacket to cover the vest and the gun. Walked back to the front door where Diana waited, hope and fear fighting for control of her expression. Both of them understanding that whatever happened next would define the rest of their lives. I'll get your daughter back. Jamie's voice was flat, operational, the tone he used when emotions became liabilities. But you need to do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that? Diana nodded so hard her whole body shook. Jamie pulled out his phone, brought up a new message screen. What's Sophie's phone number? Diana rattled it off, digits tumbling over each other. Jamie typed quickly, Mom's friend is coming. Trust him. He sent it, then immediately deleted the message from the sent folder. If Diana was telling the truth, the kidnappers wouldn't be monitoring a 9-year-old's phone closely. If she was lying, if this was some kind of elaborate trap, Jamie would know soon enough. What's the layout of the warehouse? Diana pulled in a shaking breath, closed her eyes like she was forcing herself to remember details through trauma. Big open floor, maybe 60 feet by 80, shipping containers stacked in the center, creating corridors and blind spots. They're keeping Sophie in one of the containers. Blue door, second row from the back. There's an office on the west side, raised platform with windows overlooking the floor. Most of them stay there, cameras at the front entrance, but the loading dock in back is blind. That's how I got out. Jamie absorbed the information, already building the tactical picture in his mind. Warehouse meant echo, meant every sound would carry. Containers meant limited sightlines, but good cover. Office with overview meant they'd see him coming unless he controlled the approach. Cameras at front but not back meant either budget constraints or incompetence, both of which he could use. How are they armed? Pistols on their hips, like I said. I saw two with rifles, the black ones with the curved magazines. No idea if they have more weapons in the office. Body armor? I don't think so. Just regular clothes, jeans and jackets. Jamie nodded. That was good. Meant they weren't expecting resistance, weren't prepared for someone who knew what they were doing. Bad meant they might be more trigger-happy, more likely to panic and make fatal mistakes. You're going to drive me there. Park 2 blocks away, somewhere with street visibility. Then you're going to call 911 from your cell and report gunshots at that address. Tell them officer needs assistance, possible hostage situation. That'll get them moving fast. Full response. But you wait until I text you the signal. Understand? But you said not to call the police. I said there's no time for their protocols. I didn't say they shouldn't come. We just need to control when and how. Jamie checked his watch. 3:47. They'll move Sophie at 4, which means I have 13 minutes to get in position. We need to go now. Diana stumbled toward an old Honda Civic parked in the visitor section, and Jamie followed. Every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that he was making the same mistake he'd made in Syria, choosing violence over being there for Emma. But what choice did he have? A 9-year-old girl was trapped in a shipping container somewhere, waiting for men who saw her as inventory or collateral, or whatever cold calculation they'd made that let them steal children in the night. If Jamie did nothing, he'd spend the rest of his life knowing he could have saved her, that he'd let another little girl lose what Emma had lost because he was too afraid to pick up a gun one more time. They drove in silence through empty Portland streets, the city at that dead hour when even the drunks had gone home and the early workers hadn't started their day. Streetlights threw long shadows. The Willamette River reflected bridge lights and moon in patterns that looked almost peaceful, almost beautiful, almost like a city that didn't have children disappearing in the night. Jamie rolled down the window, let cold December air sharpen his focus. His right shoulder ached where an insurgent's knife had found him in Kabul. His ribs remembered the IED blast in Helmand that had killed 2 of his teammates and left him with hearing damage in his left ear. His hands knew exactly how to kill quickly and quietly. Knowledge burned into muscle and nerve until it was indistinguishable from breathing. He'd spent 15 years becoming a weapon, 3 years trying to forget how. And now here he was, sliding back into it like a suit that had been hanging in the closet. Waiting. The textile mill rose against the skyline like a tombstone. 6 stories of dark windows and corrugated metal. Most of the complex abandoned for a decade, leaving it to transients and drug dealers, and now, apparently, kidnappers who needed somewhere isolated to do their work. Chain-link fence surrounded the property, but sections had been cut away, peeled back like someone opening a tin can. Diana parked 2 blocks north, killed the engine. She turned to Jamie with desperate eyes that reminded him too much of Sarah's in those last few months, when she'd been trying to convince him not to re-enlist, trying to make him see that he was choosing the wrong war. Bring her back. Diana's voice was barely a whisper. Please. Jamie didn't answer. He was already gone, sliding into the operational mindset that had kept him alive through 200 missions in places that didn't officially exist on any deployment record. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Doubt was a death sentence. Right now, he wasn't James Harrison, CEO who'd built a $50 million company from nothing, father of an 8-year-old girl who made Sunday pancakes because it reminded him of Sarah. He was Petty Officer First Class Harrison, call sign Hammer, and he had a target to neutralize. Jamie approached the warehouse from the southeast, using abandoned cars and dumpsters for cover, moving with practiced silence that was part training and part instinct. The loading dock was exactly where Diana said it would be, metal door hanging open 6 inches, dark gap like a mouth waiting to swallow him. No guards visible from this angle, But that didn't mean they weren't there. He crouched behind a rusted forklift and watched, waited, breathed. His instructors at Coronado used to say patience was a SEAL's greatest weapon, that most men died because they moved too soon, let adrenaline override training, forgot that warfare was 90% waiting and 10% violence compressed into seconds that felt like hours. 3 minutes passed. 4. Then Jamie saw the orange glow of a cigarette near the northwest corner of the building. Guard doing a lazy patrol, more interested in his smoke than his job, moving in a pattern that was predictable enough to be fatal. 30 seconds to the corner, 45-second pause while he smoked, 30 seconds back. Jamie marked the timing, watched 2 complete rotations to confirm, then moved during the pause, closing 50 meters of open ground in absolute silence, staying low, using shadows that were deeper than the man's awareness. When the guard turned to start his return patrol, Jamie was already inside his range, hand clamping over his mouth, arms snaking around his neck in a blood choke that cut off oxygen to the brain without crushing the windpipe. The guard struggled for 7 seconds before going limp. Jamie lowered him to the ground, zip-tied his wrists and ankles with ties from his vest pocket, gagged him with his own shirt. 1 down, 5 to go, maybe more. The math was always shifting in combat, always changing, always trying to kill you. The loading dock door opened into darkness thick enough to drown in. Jamie pulled a small tactical flashlight from his vest but didn't turn it on yet. Let his eyes adjust instead, finding shapes and shadows, building a map of the space from memory and feel, and the kind of awareness that came from doing this too many times to count. The warehouse floor opened up exactly like Diana described. Massive space, 60 by 80 easy, maybe bigger. Shipping containers stacked in the center, creating a maze of steel corridors and blind corners. Somewhere in that maze was Sophie Chen. Somewhere in the office on the west side were the men who'd taken her. Jamie moved along the wall using container shadows for cover, placing each footstep with deliberate care on concrete that was cracked and uneven and loud if you didn't know how to move across it. He could hear voices now, coming from the office Diana had mentioned, male voices, laughing about something Jamie couldn't make out and didn't care about. These men were trafficking children and laughing. That was all he needed to know. The blue container was exactly where Diana said. Second row, 40 feet from the office, doors secured with a heavy padlock on the outside that looked new, industrial grade. Jamie pressed his ear against the cold metal. Listened. There, faint breathing, the sound of someone trying very hard to be quiet. He pulled bolt cutters from his vest, positioned them carefully around the padlock shackle. Squeezed. The metal sheared with a sound like breaking teeth, loud enough in the silence that Jamie froze, waiting for reaction from the office. Nothing. Either they hadn't heard or didn't care. Amateur hour. Jamie opened the container door slowly, wincing at the scrape of metal on metal that seemed loud as gunfire in his combat-trained ears. Inside, a small figure huddled in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, face buried against her legs, like she was trying to make herself disappear. Sophie. The girl looked up. 9 years old with her mother's Asian features, glasses crooked on her face, wearing a purple jacket over jeans that were torn at the knee. Her face was tear-streaked, but her eyes were sharp, alert, taking in Jamie with an assessment that was too mature for her age. Survivor's eyes. He'd seen them before on rescued hostages, children who'd been through hell but hadn't broken yet. Your mom sent me. Jamie kept his voice to a whisper, barely audible even in the container's confined space. Sophie didn't speak, just nodded, watching him with careful intensity. We need to go right now. Can you walk? Sophie stood on shaking legs. She was small for 9, skinny in the way of kids who'd skipped too many meals. But she moved well, no visible injuries beyond scrapes and bruises. Her hands were bound in front of her with zip ties. Jamie pulled out his knife, cut them off with a quick motion that made Sophie flinch but not cry out. Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you run and don't look back. Understand? Sophie nodded again, still not speaking, and Jamie wondered what they'd done to her to make her this quiet, what threats or violence had stolen her voice. Rage flickered through his operational calm, but he pushed it down. Emotion got people killed. He led Sophie back along the path he'd taken, moving slow and careful, one hand behind him to keep her close. They were 20 feet from the loading dock, 20 feet from escape, when a door slammed somewhere behind them. Voices suddenly sharp and alert, shouting in Spanish. Someone had found the guard Jamie had taken down, or checked the container, or noticed the cut padlock. Either way, the window had just collapsed. Go! Jamie pushed Sophie toward the loading dock, putting his body between her and the voices that were getting louder, closer, more organized. Sophie ran, purple jacket disappearing into the darkness, and Jamie turned back toward the threat, pulling the Sig Sauer from his jacket. He didn't want to shoot, didn't want to kill, didn't want to become that person again, the one who solved problems with controlled pairs and center mass hits. But men were spilling out of the office now, 4 of them visible, armed and angry. One of them spotted Sophie's retreating form, raised his pistol toward a 9-year-old girl's back. Jamie fired twice. The first round caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him. The second hit his gun arm, sending the pistol clattering across concrete. The man went down screaming, and the others scattered, returning firewalled and panicked, bullets sparking off metal containers around Jamie's head with sounds like angry hornets. He dropped behind the forklift he'd used earlier, returned fire with the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours on ranges and in kill houses and in actual combat where missing meant dying. These men weren't trained soldiers. They moved wrong, exposed themselves wrong, fired in bursts that emptied magazines without hitting anything. Jamie put 2 more down with leg shots, aiming to disable rather than kill, still holding on to some fragment of the promise he'd made 3 years ago. The remaining 2 retreated back toward the office, dragging their wounded. Silence fell, broken only by groaning from the men Jamie had shot and the ringing in his ears from gunfire in an enclosed space. The smell of cordite brought back memories of Syria, of Kabul, of every firefight he'd survived and everyone he hadn't quite escaped. He'd promised himself he'd never smell that smell again, never feel the hot brass of spent casings rolling across his boots, never taste the copper penny flavor of adrenaline and fear mixing in his mouth. But here he was, breaking promises. Jamie started to retreat toward the loading dock when a new voice stopped him cold. James Harrison. The voice came from the office doorway, calm and controlled, speaking his name with the kind of confidence that came from having all the cards. A man stepped out, backlit by fluorescent office lights, tall and lean with movements that marked military training of some kind. He wasn't holding a pistol like his men. He carried an AR-15, held low and ready with the casual competence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "You don't remember me." The man walked forward, boots clicking on concrete, rifle never wavering from Jamie's position behind the forklift. "But I remember you. Syria, 2018. You and your team hit a weapons market in Deir ez-Zor. My brother was there. Wrong place, wrong time. You shot him in the street like a dog." The memory surfaced like a drowning man breaking water. Details Jamie had spent 3 years trying to bury, forcing their way back into clarity. Syria. The night raid that had gone wrong because intelligence was bad, because someone had missed the detail that the market doubled as a civilian gathering space, because Jamie's team had taken fire from a rooftop and returned it without proper target identification. A man had fallen. The after-action report said unarmed civilian, 23 years old, engaged to be married. One of 17 deaths that night that shouldn't have happened, 17 names added to the list Jamie carried that was already too long. His name was Carlos. The man with the rifle took another step forward, and Jamie could see his face now in the ambient light filtering through warehouse windows. Latino features, early 40s maybe, scar running down his right forearm, eyes that held the kind of cold anger that came from grief turned to stone. Carlos Herrera, 23 years old. He was buying lumber that morning to finish a house he was building for his fiancée, and you murdered him for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jamie's finger tightened on the SIG's trigger. "I didn't know, you didn't care." The man's voice was flat, dead, emptied of everything except the need for this moment. "None of you cared. You came into our countries, kicked down our doors, killed our families, and called it service. Called it protecting America. Called it anything except what it was. Murder dressed up in a flag." Jamie had no answer for that, because the man was right. Carlos Herrera had been innocent, and Jamie had killed him anyway. And no amount of after-action counseling or commanders telling him it wasn't his fault had changed the fundamental truth that a 23-year-old man was dead because Jamie had pulled a trigger without being sure of his target. So here's the thing, Harrison. The man raised his rifle slightly, not quite aiming, but close enough that Jamie could see down the barrel even in the darkness. My name is Miguel Herrera. I've spent 4 years finding you, another 9 months planning this. And I want you to know Diana did good work bringing you here. Took 6 months to locate you, another 3 to set everything up. Jamie's blood went cold. Diana, she works for me, has for months now. Miguel smiled, and it was the cruelest thing Jamie had ever seen. Worse than the smile of insurgents who'd booby-trapped children. Worse than the grin of a Taliban fighter he'd interrogated who'd bragged about the things he'd done to prisoners. Diana's daughter is real, and she really is in that container. But you were the target, Harrison. Always were. The world tilted. Jamie's mind raced through every interaction with Diana, looking for the tells he'd missed, the signs that she was playing him. The bruises had been real, he'd seen them up close. The fear in her voice when she talked about Sophie had seemed genuine. But Miguel was a professional, and professionals knew how to sell a lie until it became truth. Here's your choice. Miguel's voice was steady, almost gentle, like a therapist walking someone through a hard decision. You can die here, and your daughter Emma wakes up tomorrow to police at her door telling her daddy's gone. She becomes an orphan, just like I became without Carlos. Or, and this is the interesting part, you can put down that gun and walk away. Go home to Emma, live your life, never look back. Jamie's grip on the cig tightened. What's the catch? The catch is you leave Sophie here. Walk away and let my men collect her. Prove to me that you care more about your kid than some random girl you met tonight. Show me that blood means more than principle. Miguel's smile widened. That's all. Just choose. Your daughter or someone else's. Family or strangers. The choice you should have made 4 years ago in Syria instead of playing hero and killing my brother. Jamie looked at the gun in his hand. Thought about Emma asleep in her unicorn pajamas, dreaming dreams that didn't include men with rifles and fathers who didn't come home. If he died here, she'd wake up to a nightmare worse than anything her 8-year-old mind could imagine. Police at the door, Jamie's body in the morgue. A whole life of knowing her father had chosen to save someone else instead of being there for her. She'd be alone, orphaned, everything Sarah had feared. But if he walked away, if he left Sophie behind in that container for Miguel's men to collect or kill or whatever cold plan they'd made for her, he'd become something worse than dead. He'd become the man who saved himself by abandoning a child, who valued his own comfort over someone else's life, who proved that every cynic who ever said civilians only care about their own was right. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I'm walking out. Jamie's voice was steady, operational, showing nothing. And I'm taking Sophie with me. Miguel's expression hardened. Then you die. Everything happened fast. Miguel raised the AR-15. Jamie dove left, firing as he moved. But adrenaline threw his aim and the first 2 shots went wide, sparking off concrete. The rifle barked, rounds chewing into the floor where Jamie had been standing, concrete chips spraying like shrapnel. Jamie rolled behind a container, breathing hard, shoulder burning where something had hit him. Not a bullet. He'd know that pain, intimate and immediate. Shrapnel maybe, or a ricochet fragment. Blood was warm and spreading under his jacket, but he was still moving, still functional, still in the fight. He couldn't win this. Miguel had superior position, superior firepower, and backup coming. Jamie could hear men moving through the warehouse now, closing in, voices coordinating in Spanish that was too fast for him to follow. 3 rounds left in his current magazine. 1 spare. 17 bullets against 6 targets with rifles and cover and time on their side. The math didn't work. Then sirens. Faint at first, but getting louder, coming from multiple directions. Diana had called 911 like he'd told her, or the gunfire had drawn attention. Either way, police were coming, and that changed everything. Miguel heard them too, swore in Spanish, fired 3 more rounds at Jamie's position, then disappeared back into the office. 30 seconds later, an engine roared to life somewhere on the north side of the building. A loading bay door Jamie hadn't seen rolled open, and headlights swept across the warehouse as a van peeled out into the night. Jamie waited until the sound faded before stumbling toward the loading dock. His shoulder screamed with every movement, blood soaking through his jacket now. But he was alive. More importantly, Sophie was alive, running toward the street where Diana's Honda waited. He made it 2 blocks before the shock caught up with him, collapsed against a chain-link fence, gasping, vision swimming. The wound in his shoulder wasn't fatal, but it was bad. He needed a hospital, needed someone to clean and stitch, and probably prescribe antibiotics because God knew what bacteria lived on warehouse floors. But hospitals meant questions, police reports, explanations he couldn't give without exposing Diana and Sophie to more danger, without revealing he'd violated about 15 different laws in the last 30 minutes. Jamie pulled his phone, texted Diana, "Get Sophie home." Disappeared. "Don't come back." Then he deleted the message from his sent folder, threw the phone in a dumpster, and kept moving. His truck was where he'd left it, 3 blocks north of Diana's parking spot. Jamie climbed in, started the engine with hands that were shaking harder now that the adrenaline was fading. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and pain, every turn sending fresh agony through his shoulder, every breath reminding him he'd just broken every promise he'd made to Sarah's memory. 4:47 a.m. When he pulled into the parking garage of his building, the sky was lightening, dawn coming whether Jamie was ready for it or not. Emma would wake up at 6:30 for school, would come looking for him, would ask questions he'd have to answer with lies or half-truths or whatever story he could build that wouldn't terrify an 8-year-old. Jamie stumbled into his penthouse, locked the door behind him, went straight to the bathroom, stripped off his jacket and shirt, examined the wound in the mirror. 3-inch furrow across his shoulder where a metal fragment had torn through skin, deep enough to scar but not deep enough to hit bone. He could work with that. He cleaned it with peroxide that made him bite down on a towel to keep from screaming, bandaged it with gauze and medical tape from the first aid kit he kept stocked because old habits died hard. Put on a clean shirt that would hide the damage, black fabric that wouldn't show blood if the wound opened again. When he opened the bathroom door, Emma was standing in the hallway. "Daddy." Her voice was small, scared, seeing through whatever mask Jamie had tried to put on. She looked at him with those eyes that were too much like Sarah's, too perceptive, too aware that something was wrong. "Where did you go?" Jamie knelt down, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and pulled his daughter into a hug that was tighter than he meant it to be, desperate in a way Emma couldn't understand, but responded to anyway, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "I had to help someone." His voice was quiet against her hair, barely more than a whisper. "The lady with the hurt face." Emma pulled back, looked at him with an expression that was too old for 8, too knowing. "Did you break your promise?" She meant the promise he'd made after Sarah's funeral, standing in the living room of their old house with Emma crying in his arms, both of them trying to understand how the world could be so cruel. The promise that he was done with violence, done with the military life that had taken him away so many times, done with being the kind of man who solved problems with guns. "Yeah, baby, I did." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she hugged him tighter and whispered words that broke something in Jamie's chest that had been barely holding together for 3 years. "Mom would have wanted you to help her. I know she would." Jamie closed his eyes and held his daughter and tried not to think about how close he'd come to making her an orphan. Outside, Portland woke up to another December morning. Somewhere Diana and Sophie were trying to process what they'd survived. Somewhere Miguel Herrera was planning his next move. And here, in a penthouse that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime, James Harrison held the only thing that mattered and wondered if he'd just saved a life or destroyed his own. "It's okay, Daddy." Emma's voice was muffled against his shoulder. "You came back. That's what matters." But as Jamie stood there in the hallway holding his daughter while his shoulder bled through the bandage and sirens echoed somewhere in the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped back into a war he'd thought was over. That Miguel's words were a promise, not a threat. That somewhere in the darkness, violence was waiting to drag him back under. And the worst part was knowing that when it came for him again, and it would come, he was certain of that now, he wouldn't be able to walk away. Because men like Miguel didn't stop. Men like Jamie didn't get to retire. And little girls like Sophie and Emma kept needing fathers who were willing to become monsters to keep them safe. The sun rose over Portland, cold and distant, illuminating a city that didn't know how close it had come to more headlines about missing children. Jamie carried Emma back to her room, tucked her in even though she was too old for it, watched her fall back asleep with the kind of ease that only came from not knowing what fathers did in the dark. Then he went back to the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror, saw the blood seeping through his shirt, saw the exhaustion carved into his face, saw the ghost of the seal he'd been and the father he was trying to be, and wondered if it was possible to be both without one destroying the other. The answer, he suspected, was no, but he was going to try anyway. For Emma, for Sophie, for Diana, wherever she was, for all the promises he'd made and broken and would have to live with until the end. Outside his window, Portland went about its business, oblivious. And in the distance, barely audible, Jamie heard sirens heading toward the warehouse by the river, where 3 men lay wounded and questions were piling up that nobody would answer. He'd bought them time, maybe. A few hours, a few days before the connections were made and the investigation led back to him. But time was all anyone ever had, really. Time to make choices, time to live with them, time to hope that when the final accounting came, the good you'd done outweighed the damage you'd caused. Jamie closed his eyes and tried to believe it. Tried to believe that Sarah would understand. Tried to believe that Emma would forgive him for breaking his promise. Tried to believe that somewhere in the mess he'd just made, he'd actually saved someone instead of just adding more weight to scales that were already tipping toward darkness. The trying, he thought, would have to be enough. Miguel's voice had stopped echoing in Jamie's skull somewhere around the 3rd hour of surgery. The doctors at Providence, Portland, worked on his shoulder while he drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of the warehouse confrontation mixing with older memories until he couldn't tell which wounds were fresh and which had been bleeding for years. Diana's face was the first clear thing he saw when the anesthesia finally released him. She sat in a chair by his bed, still wearing the clothes from that night, but cleaner now, the blood wiped away and her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger and older at the same time. The bruises around her eye had been treated, the swelling already shifting from purple toward the yellow-green of healing. "You're awake." Her voice carried none of the desperate energy from his doorstep. Something had changed in the hours since he'd pushed Sophie toward safety and turned back to face men with guns. Diana looked at him now with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude tangled up with guilt, tangled up with something else he didn't have a name for yet. "Sophie?" "Safe. FBI took her statement this morning. They were gentle with her, had a specialist who works with children." Diana's hands were folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "She's asking about you. Wanted to come see you, but I thought it might be too much. She's been through so much already." Jamie tried to sit up, felt his shoulders scream in protest, and fell back against pillows that smelled like antiseptic and institutional detergent. The movement sent fresh pain radiating down his arm and across his chest, a reminder that shrapnel didn't care about willpower or training or the promises men made to their daughters. Miguel, gone. Diana stood, walked to the window, looked out at Portland, waking up to another morning that didn't know how close it had come to tragedy. Police found the van abandoned near the river. No prints, no DNA, nothing useful. He had an exit strategy planned for months, probably across the border by now. The words settled into Jamie's chest like stones. Miguel Herrera was still out there, still planning, still waiting for another chance to destroy everything Jamie cared about. The revenge hadn't ended in that warehouse, had only been delayed, pushed back to some future moment when Jamie's guard would be down and his family would be vulnerable. "Did you know?" Jamie asked it quietly, the question he'd been turning over in his mind since Miguel's revelation. Diana's shoulders tensed, her reflection in the window glass showing him the pain his words had caused. "No." Her voice cracked on the single syllable. "I swear to you, Jamie, I had no idea. He told me he was a fixer, someone who helped people with problems too complicated for police. Said Sophie had witnessed something she shouldn't have. That men were after her. That the only way to keep her safe was to bring you into it because you had military training and resources. Why me specifically? He knew about your donation to the hospital, knew you were ex-Navy, lived alone with your daughter, had the kind of background that meant you wouldn't turn away from someone in trouble. Diana turned from the window and there were tears on her cheeks now, silent and steady. He was right about that part, wasn't he? You couldn't say no to a woman begging for her child's life. Jamie thought about the choice he'd faced in that warehouse. Miguel's voice offering him an impossible equation. His daughter or someone else's. Safety or conscience. The kind of man who walks away or the kind who stays and fights even when the math doesn't work. I couldn't leave Sophie in that container. Couldn't go home to Emma and pretend everything was fine while a 9-year-old waited for men who saw her as inventory. Diana crossed back to his bedside, sat down heavily in the chair like her legs had finally given out. The FBI thinks Miguel is connected to trafficking operations along the entire West Coast. They've been building a case for years, but he's careful. Uses intermediaries, never leaves evidence. Disappears before anyone can get close. Her voice dropped. Sophie and I are going to testify, give them everything we remember about where they kept us, what we saw, who we can identify. That makes you targets. We were already targets. Diana met his eyes and Jamie saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Resolve, maybe, or the particular courage that came from having nothing left to lose. At least now we're targets who matter to the FBI. They're putting us in witness protection until the trial. New city, new names, fresh start away from everything that happened here. Jamie absorbed that information, felt something twist in his chest that he didn't want to examine too closely. He'd known Diana for less than 12 hours. Had met her daughter for maybe 5 minutes total. There was no reason for her departure to feel like loss. No logical explanation for the hollow space opening up behind his ribs. I'm sorry, the words came out before he could stop them. For what Miguel did. For whatever part I played in making you a target. Diana's laugh was bitter, broken around the edges. You're apologizing to me? You got shot saving my daughter. Walked into a trap that should have killed you because a stranger showed up at your door with an impossible story. If anyone should be sorry. The door opened before she could finish. A man in a suit walked in, FBI credentials visible on his belt, face arranged in the professional neutrality of someone who'd conducted hundreds of interviews exactly like this one. Mr. Harrison, I'm Special Agent Torres. We need to discuss what happened at that warehouse. The next 3 hours were a careful dance of truth and omission. Jamie explained Diana's arrival at his penthouse, the kidnapping story, his decision to attempt a rescue. He described the warehouse layout, the number of men he'd encountered, the firefight that had ended with 3 of them wounded and the rest escaping into the night. He left out Miguel's real identity, left out the connection to Syria, to Carlos Herrera, to the civilian Jamie had killed in a weapons market 4 years ago. The FBI didn't need to know that this had been personal. Didn't need to know that Jamie was carrying guilt for a death that had set this entire chain of events in motion. Some weights were meant to be carried alone. Torres asked about Diana's role, about whether Jamie had suspected anything before the confrontation with Miguel. Jamie told him no, told him Diana had been as much a victim as Sophie, told him the truth about that part at least. Whatever mistakes Diana had made, she'd made them trying to save her daughter. That wasn't something Jamie could hold against her. When Torres finally left, promising follow-up interviews and paperwork and all the bureaucratic machinery that ground forward, regardless of human trauma, Jamie found Diana waiting in the hallway outside his room. Sophie was with her now, the 9-year-old looking smaller than she had in the warehouse. More fragile, like the adrenaline that had kept her moving had finally drained away. Sophie approached Jamie's wheelchair. The nurses had insisted despite his protests, and held out a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady, meeting his with an intensity that reminded him of her mother. I made this while we were waiting, for you. Jamie took the paper, unfolded it carefully. A child's drawing in crayon, the kind of art that revealed more about the artist than any technical skill could capture. A tall figure in black stood in the center, angular and strong. Beside him, a smaller figure in purple, holding his hand. Above them both, a yellow sun with rays stretching toward the edges of the page. And across the top, in careful block letters that must have taken her several attempts to get right, "Thank you for saving me." Jamie's throat closed up. He looked at this 9-year-old who'd been used as bait, traumatized by violence she couldn't possibly understand, and saw Emma in her place. Saw every child who'd ever been caught in crossfires they didn't start, paying prices for adult failures they didn't deserve. You're welcome, Sophie. She didn't smile. Jamie suspected it would be a long time before smiling came easily to her again. But she nodded, something passing between them that didn't require words. The understanding of survivors. The recognition that some experiences created bonds stronger than blood or time or distance. Diana touched Sophie's shoulder, guiding her toward the elevators. At the last moment, she turned back, and Jamie saw the tears she'd been holding in finally break free. Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for everything. He watched them go, mother and daughter disappearing into a future that would be shaped by what had happened in that warehouse. Wanted to tell Diana that it wasn't over, that Miguel would be back, that the violence he'd brought to her door wouldn't stay buried forever. But what good would that do? She had enough to carry without adding his fears to the load. The nurses wheeled him back to his room, changed his bandages, checked his vitals, gave him pills that pushed the pain into a distant corner where he could almost ignore it. Emma called around noon, her voice bright and worried in equal measure, asking why Daddy sounded so tired and when he was coming home. Just a long night, sweetheart. I'll be back soon. We can make pancakes tomorrow if you want. Promise? The word hit him harder than any bullet. He'd made so many promises, to Sarah, to Emma, to himself. Broken most of them in one way or another, traded vows for violence, traded presence for purpose. Now here he was, 42 years old, lying in a hospital bed because he couldn't stop trying to save people, even when saving them might cost his daughter her father. Yeah, baby, I promise. He hung up and stared at the ceiling and wondered how many more promises he could make before the weight of them crushed whatever was left of the man Sarah had loved. A knock at the door pulled him from thoughts that were spiraling toward darkness. Jamie turned his head, expecting another nurse or FBI follow-up, and found Marcus Bradley standing in the doorway instead. Marcus looked exactly like what he was, a 55-year-old venture capitalist who'd made his money betting on other people's dreams and extracting his percentage regardless of whether those dreams succeeded or failed. Silver hair perfectly styled, suit tailored to hide the softness of a body that hadn't seen a gym in years, eyes sharp with the particular intelligence of predators who hunted in boardrooms instead of jungles. Jamie, what the hell happened? Jamie considered how much to reveal, weighed the cost of truth against the complications of lies, and decided that Marcus deserved at least part of the story. Kidnapping situation. Woman came to me for help. Her daughter was taken. Police couldn't move fast enough. I did what I had to do. Marcus closed the door with the careful deliberation of someone about to deliver bad news. Crossed to the chair Diana had occupied and sat down, elbows on knees, voice dropping to the register of confidential conversations and unpleasant truths. The board received a call this morning. Reporter from the Oregonian asking for comment on why Harrison Security's CEO was involved in a shootout at an abandoned warehouse. 3 men hospitalized, FBI investigation ongoing, and you lying here with what the nurses tell me is a significant wound. It was shrapnel, not a bullet. The distinction matters. Does it? Marcus leaned back, studied Jamie with the cold assessment of an investor evaluating a troubled asset. Harrison Security provides protection for Fortune 500 companies, government contractors, people who trust us to keep them safe. How does it look when our CEO is getting into firefights with human traffickers? It looks like I saved a 9-year-old girl's life. It looks like you're unstable. Marcus stood, walked to the window the same way Diana had, but the gesture meant something different when it came from him. Calculated instead of vulnerable, strategic instead of wounded. The board has been concerned about you for months, Jamie. Missing meetings, distracted during presentations. Emma's school called the office twice because you were unreachable during pickup. Now this. Jamie felt something cold settle in his chest. My daughter needed me. The company can survive without me for a few hours. Can it? The Nakamura contract is up for renewal next month. $30 million in annual revenue. You think they're going to trust a company whose CEO makes headlines for vigilante violence? There was nothing Jamie could say that would make Marcus understand. No way to explain that contracts and revenue and shareholder confidence meant nothing compared to the weight of a child's life. Nothing compared to the choice between being safe and being human. The board is meeting Monday. Marcus turned from the window, face arranged in the professional sympathy of someone delivering a death sentence. We're discussing your future with the company. I'd recommend you be there, prepared to explain yourself and present a plan for managing the fallout. Otherwise, they might start discussing leadership changes. He left without waiting for a response. Jamie stared at the closed door and felt the architecture of his life shifting, foundations cracking, walls threatening to collapse. The company he'd built from nothing while grief tried to swallow him whole. The daughter who needed stability more than heroism. The woman who'd crashed into his existence and disappeared just as quickly, taking her daughter into witness protection and leaving nothing behind but questions. 3 years ago, Sarah had died waiting for him to come home from war. He'd sworn on her grave that he would change, would be present, would build something that mattered without destroying himself in the process. Harrison's security was supposed to be that something. Emma was supposed to be that purpose. And now both were slipping through his fingers because he couldn't stop reaching for people who needed saving. The pills dragged him towards sleep. His last thought before consciousness faded was of Emma's voice asking him to promise, and the terrible knowledge that some promises were just lies we told children to help them sleep. 2 weeks passed like water through a broken dam, each day carrying away more of the structure Jamie had built to contain his life. The wound healed to an angry red line across his shoulder, a scar that would fade with time but never quite disappear. The FBI investigation stalled, Miguel's trail going cold somewhere south of San Diego. The Oregonian ran their piece on page 6, careful enough to avoid naming Jamie directly, but leaving breadcrumbs for anyone motivated to connect the dots. Diana Chen vanished into witness protection. No forwarding address, no contact information, just a brief email from Agent Torres confirming safe relocation. Jamie read it 3 times, looking for subtext, and found only the cold efficiency of bureaucratic communication. The board met on Monday, as Marcus had promised. Jamie sat through 3 hours of questions that were accusations dressed in professional language, defended his actions with calm precision that masked the fury building beneath his composure. In the end, they voted to give him 60 days to stabilize the situation, 60 days to prove that Harrison Security's CEO wasn't a liability, 60 days to save everything he'd spent 3 years building while a cartel boss planned revenge from across the border. He told himself Diana's absence was for the best. She'd been a stranger who knocked on his door in desperation, nothing more. Whatever connection he had imagined during those frantic hours of violence was just adrenaline in proximity, the kind of bond that formed between survivors and faded once normal life resumed. But normal life wasn't resuming. Normal life was Emma asking why Daddy seemed sad, why he stayed up late staring out windows, why he kept checking his phone like he expected news that never came. Normal life was Marcus watching him across boardroom tables with predator patience, waiting for the slip that would justify the leadership change he'd been angling toward for months. Normal life was waking at 2:17 every morning, exactly the time Diana had knocked, heart pounding with memories he couldn't escape. Christmas approached with the mechanical inevitability of seasons that didn't care about human suffering. Portland decorated itself in lights and tinsel, performing holiday cheer for tourists and children, while Jamie went through motions that felt increasingly hollow. He hired a service to decorate the penthouse, watched them transform his living space into a magazine photograph of celebration, and felt nothing when they finished, except a vague sense that something essential was missing. Emma's face when she saw the results confirmed his suspicion. This doesn't feel like Christmas. She stood in the living room, 8 years old and too perceptive, looking at the perfectly coordinated ornaments in the professionally arranged garland and the tree that cost more than most families spend on their entire holiday. What do you mean? We have everything. Emma shrugged, wisdom wrapped in disappointment. It's not warm, not like when Mommy was here. She always let me help. Let me put the star on top. This is just stuff. Jamie pulled his daughter close, breathed in the scent of her shampoo, and felt failure settle into his bones with the weight of accumulated years. He'd thrown money at Christmas the same way he threw money at everything else. The penthouse, the company, the illusion of success that crumbled to nothing when examined from the inside. I'm sorry, baby. I'll do better next year. But next year was an abstraction, a promise that meant nothing against the reality of his daughter staring at a tree that represented everything wrong with the life he'd built since Sarah died. December 20th arrived gray and cold, 5 days before a Christmas that felt more like obligation than celebration. Jamie was in his office at Harrison Security, reviewing quarterly projections that mattered less with each passing hour, when his assistant knocked with news that stopped his heart. "Mr. Harrison? Someone here to see you. Says it's personal." Jamie looked up from spreadsheets that had blurred together like the days themselves and felt the world tilt on its axis. Diana Chen stood in his doorway. She looked different. The bruises had healed completely, leaving no visible trace of the violence she'd survived. Her hair was shorter now, professional, and she wore business clothes that looked new and slightly uncomfortable on her frame. But her eyes were the same, dark and deep and carrying weight that most people would never understand. "Can we talk?" Jamie's assistant hovered uncertainly in the background. He waved her away, watched Diana close the door behind her, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "I thought you were in witness protection." "I was." Diana crossed to the chair across from his desk, but didn't sit, standing with her hands clasped like someone delivering news they'd rehearsed 100 times. "Seattle. My sister lives there, helped us get set up. New apartment, new school for Sophie, new job at Harborview Medical Center. Everything was supposed to be fresh start, clean slate, leave Portland behind forever." "What changed?" Diana finally sat, perching on the edge of the chair like she might bolt at any moment. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." The words landed between them, unexpected, loaded with meaning Jamie wasn't prepared to interpret. "You saved my daughter's life, walked into a trap that should have killed you, got shot, nearly died, all for a woman you'd never met and a child you had no reason to care about." Diana leaned forward, intensity in her expression that reminded him of that night at his door. "That's not something I can just forget. Not something I can walk away from without at least trying to understand. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Diana shook her head, something fierce in her voice now. "You did what nobody else would do. My whole life, I've been surrounded by men who only act when there's something in it for them. Eric married me because I was convenient, left when things got hard. Miguel used me as bait because I was desperate enough to believe his lies. But you had nothing to gain. Could have closed the door, called security, protected yourself and Emma. Instead, you chose to help." Jamie thought about the calculation he'd made that night, the choice that had seemed so clear in the moment and so complicated in every moment since. "I'm not a hero, Diana. I'm a man with blood on his hands and guilt I can't escape, and a company that's falling apart because I can't stop making choices that hurt the people who depend on me. You're a man who chose to help when nobody else would." Diana stood, walked to his window, looked out at Portland, spreading beneath them like a map of lives being lived in ignorance of how close they'd come to tragedy. "That's heroic enough for me. I was going to move to Seattle permanently. Start over, build a new life, pretend none of this ever happened. Sophie would grow up somewhere nobody knew her story, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to forget the night I almost lost her." Diana met his eyes, and there were tears on her cheeks now, silent and steady. "But I don't want to run anymore. I've been running my whole life, from my parents who wanted me to be something I wasn't, from Eric who wanted me to be less than I am, from every situation that got hard or scary or complicated. You didn't run. When I showed up at your door with an impossible story and a desperate plea, you walked toward the problem instead of away. That's what I need. Someone who walks toward things." Jamie's throat tightened. "The board wants me out. Miguel's still out there planning God knows what. Emma needs stability, not more upheaval in her life." "I know." Diana reached out, touched his hand, and the contact was electric, unexpected, a connection he hadn't felt since before Sarah's funeral. "That's why I'm not asking for anything except a chance. Coffee, maybe. A conversation that isn't about kidnapping or violence or the terrible things we've survived. And if it doesn't work, if we realize we're better as strangers who shared one awful night, then I go back to Seattle and you go back to your life and we both move on. And if it does work, then maybe we both stop being alone." Jamie looked at their hands, her fingers on his wrist, his pulse rapid beneath her touch. Thought about Emma's face when she looked at the professionally decorated Christmas tree, the disappointment she tried to hide, the longing for something real beneath all the expensive emptiness. Emma's been asking about Sophie. Says she misses having another girl to talk to. Diana smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since that night at his door. Sophie's been asking about Emma too. Said she was the first kid who didn't treat her like she was broken. Dinner. Tomorrow night. At my place. Jamie heard the words leave his mouth before he could second-guess them. Emma insists on cooking, which means pancakes, but I'm sure she'd branch out for guests. Diana's smile widened, tears still wet on her cheeks but something lighter in her expression now. Something that looked almost like hope. We'd like that. She left after that, promising to text him with details, disappearing through his office door and leaving behind a silence that felt different than before. Less empty, more like anticipation than absence. Jamie sat alone with his thoughts racing through possibilities he hadn't let himself consider in 3 years. He was 42 years old, CEO of a company that might fire him in 60 days, target of a cartel boss with a long memory, father of an 8-year-old who needed stability more than adventure. And he just invited a woman he barely knew to dinner because something in her eyes made him remember what it felt like to want a future. Sarah would have laughed at him. She'd always laughed when he did something impulsive, some remnant of the young seal who'd proposed after 3 dates because he knew, just knew, that she was worth risking everything for. Maybe Diana was too. Maybe this was Jamie's way of honoring what Sarah had taught him, that love was worth the risk, that connection mattered more than safety, that being human meant opening yourself to hurt because the alternative was a life that looked successful but felt like dying by inches. He picked up his phone, called his assistant. Cancel my meetings for tomorrow evening and find out what kind of flowers Diana Chen likes. December 21st. Jamie left work early for the first time in months, stopped at a florist, bought groceries that Emma had requested with the elaborate specificity of someone planning their first dinner party. The penthouse felt different as evening approached, less like a showroom and more like a home, though he couldn't identify exactly what had changed. Emma was everywhere at once, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, asking questions about Sophie and Diana that Jamie didn't know how to answer. Is Sophie nice? She was very brave. Braver than most adults I've known. Is her mom nice? Yeah, Jamie thought about Diana's eyes, her voice, the way she'd touched his hand like she was reaching for something solid in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. Yeah, she is. Are you going to date her? The question stopped him cold. Emma was looking at him with 8-year-old directness. No games, no subtext, just pure curiosity about the mechanics of adult relationships. I don't know, sweetheart. We're just having dinner. Okay, Emma returned to her preparations with apparent satisfaction. I hope she likes pancakes because that's what I know how to make. The doorbell rang at 6. Diana and Sophie stood in the hallway, Sophie clutching a gift bag with tissue paper spilling out, Diana holding a bottle of wine that probably cost her more than she should have spent. For a moment, nobody moved. 2 mothers who'd lost partners, 2 daughters who'd lost pieces of their world, 4 people standing on the threshold of something none of them could name. Then Emma grabbed Sophie's hand and pulled her toward the bedroom, already talking about art projects and video games, leaving the adults alone in a silence that crackled with potential. They're going to be best friends or mortal enemies. Diana watched them disappear down the hallway. No middle ground with kids that age. I'm betting on friends. Jamie took the wine, led her toward the kitchen where ingredients waited. Emma's been lonely. This penthouse is too big, too quiet. She needs more than a workaholic father who barely remembers how to have conversations that aren't about quarterly projections. Sounds familiar. Diana leaned against the counter, watching him fumble with a corkscrew. Sophie's been lost since Eric left. Doesn't trust men, doesn't open up, keeps everything locked inside like she's afraid showing emotion will drive people away. Jamie poured 2 glasses, handed one to Diana, felt the brush of her fingers against his. Is that what you need? Someone who stays when things get hard? Diana swirled the wine, considering her answer. I need to stop running. I've spent my whole life running, from expectations, from disappointments, from anything that scared me. You didn't run. That night, when everything went wrong, you walked toward the danger instead of away. That's what I want to learn. How to walk toward things. I'm not always brave. That night was survival instinct more than courage. Then teach me the difference. They cooked together or tried to. Jamie's skills were limited to reheating takeout, Diana's were rusty from years of hospital cafeteria meals. But Emma and Sophie emerged to help, and suddenly there were four people crowded around a stove that had never seen so much action, laughing at burnt onions and overcooked pasta and the beautiful disaster of humans trying to create something together. Mashed potatoes. Emma stirred a pot with fierce concentration. Mom always made mashed potatoes at Christmas. She said everyone has fancy stuff, but nobody does simple things right. Jamie's throat tightened. He'd forgotten that detail, lost it somewhere in the fog of grief. But Emma remembered. Emma kept Sarah alive in ways he'd failed to do. Can you teach me? Sophie watched with something like awe. My mom never makes them. Says they're too many carbs. Diana laughed, and the sound was warmer than anything Jamie had heard in this penthouse since before Sarah died. I think I can make an exception for Christmas. They ate at the dining table that usually sat empty, four-place settings instead of one, conversation instead of silence. The girls traded stories about schools and teachers and the particular injustices of being 8 and 9 in a world designed by adults who'd forgotten what childhood felt like. Diana told Jamie about nursing, about the ER at 3 in the morning when the city's darkness arrived in ambulances and body bags, about the exhaustion that came from saving lives while your own fell apart. Jamie told her about the company, about building something from nothing while grief tried to swallow him whole, about success that felt increasingly hollow when there was nobody to share it with. The girls disappeared back to Emma's room after dinner, leaving adults alone on the couch with wine and the tree that had seemed so empty before but now glowed with something approaching warmth. This is the best Christmas I've had in 3 years. Jamie said it quietly, surprised by his own honesty. Maybe the best since Sarah. Diana set down her glass, turned to face him. She was close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, the fine lines at their corners from too much worry and not enough joy. Can I tell you something? Her voice was soft. When I knocked on your door that night, part of me hoped you wouldn't answer. Hoped you'd be like everyone else, too caught up in your own life to care about a stranger's problems. Because if you were like everyone else, then I was right to stop believing in good people. And now I think maybe I was wrong about the world, about what's possible, about you. She kissed him, soft at first, questioning, giving him room to pull away if this was too fast or too much or too everything. But Jamie didn't pull away. He leaned in, tasting wine and hope and the possibility of something he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. When they separated, Diana's eyes were bright with tears she wasn't trying to hide. I'm scared. She whispered it like confession. Scared this won't work. Scared you'll decide I'm too complicated. Scared Miguel will come back and destroy everything before we have a chance to build it. Jamie cupped her face in his hands, felt her pulse racing beneath his fingertips. I'm scared too, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe alone. The words felt true in a way nothing had felt true in years. Whatever came next, Miguel's shadow, Marcus's scheming, the 1,000 complications of building something with another person who came with their own damage and history, Jamie would face it, because Diana was right. Running didn't solve anything. And walking towards something, even something terrifying, was the only way to find out if it was worth having. Outside, Portland settled into the quiet of winter night. Snow had started to fall, soft flakes drifting past windows and collecting on balconies and transforming the city into something that almost looked peaceful. Inside, 4 people sat in warmth and light in the tentative beginnings of something none of them had expected to find. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but sitting there with Diana's hand in his and the sound of their daughters laughing in the next room, Jamie felt something he hadn't felt since the day Sarah died. Hope. The kind that didn't promise everything would work out, but suggested that maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying anyway. January arrived with ice on the windows and something warmer growing between them. Diana stayed in Portland, turned down the Seattle position, took a job at Providence that paid less, but kept her close to whatever was building in the spaces between their conversations. She found an apartment 10 blocks from Jamie's penthouse, insisted on paying her own rent despite his offers, maintained the independence she'd fought too hard to surrender easily. The girls became inseparable within days. Emma and Sophie traded sleepovers like currency, developed private jokes and secret languages, built the kind of friendship that only children could create from shared trauma and mutual recognition. Jamie watched his daughter transform from lonely rich girl into someone who laughed easily and spoke freely and looked forward to weekends with an enthusiasm he hadn't seen since before Sarah's death. Sophie's nightmares continued, though less frequently as weeks passed. Diana mentioned them sometimes, late at night when the girls were asleep and adults sat together in quiet conversation. The therapist says she's making progress, processing what happened, learning to feel safe again. But some nights she still wakes up screaming, and I can't do anything except hold her and promise that the bad men won't come back. Jamie understood that particular helplessness, the weight of wanting to protect someone from dangers you couldn't control, from memories that lived inside them like parasites. He'd felt it with Emma after Sarah's death, watching his daughter grieve for a mother she barely remembered, unable to fill the absence no matter how many pancakes he made or bedtime stories he told. February brought complications he should have anticipated. Marcus Bradley hadn't forgotten the board meeting, hadn't stopped maneuvering for position, hadn't abandoned his conviction that Harrison Security needed leadership unburdened by personal entanglements and heroic impulses. The 60-day deadline passed without formal action, but Jamie could feel the pressure building, could sense the board coalescing around narratives that painted him as liability rather than asset. Diana noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he checked his phone during dinner, like expecting news of his own execution. She asked once gently, what was happening at work? Jamie told her about Marcus, about the board's concerns, about the slow-motion coup that might cost him everything he'd built since Sarah's death. Her response surprised him. Maybe losing the company wouldn't be the worst thing. Jamie looked at her across the kitchen table, trying to understand what she meant. You built Harrison Security because you didn't know what else to do with yourself after Sarah died. That's what you told me, but that was 3 years ago. Maybe you're not the same man who needed that company to survive. Maybe you've become someone who needs different things. He thought about her words for days afterward, turning them over like stones that might reveal something hidden underneath. The company had been his identity, his purpose, the structure that held him together when grief threatened to tear him apart. But Diana was right. He wasn't the same man who'd walked out of Sarah's funeral and into a boardroom. He'd changed in ways he was only beginning to understand, and the company he'd built might no longer fit the person he was becoming. March arrived with spring rain and the kind of hope that came from watching flowers push through soil that had seemed permanently frozen. Diana's medical debt loomed over their new life like a thundercloud, $30,000 accumulated during Sophie's pneumonia hospitalization 2 years earlier. Jamie offered to pay it off, the money barely registering in accounts built from Harrison Security's success. Diana refused. I won't be your charity case. We're partners, which means I carry my own weight. I don't want to be someone you rescued. I want to be someone who stands beside you. They fought about it for 3 days, the first real conflict since the warehouse. Jamie argued logic and practicality, pointed out that debt carried interest and stress and consequences that affected them both. Diana argued principle and pride, insisted that accepting money she hadn't earned would create an imbalance she couldn't live with. In the end, they compromised. Jamie paid off the debt as a loan, 0 interest, Diana repaying whatever she could manage each month from her nursing salary. It took her 2 weeks to accept even that arrangement, and when she did, her eyes were wet with the particular grief of someone who'd spent too long alone and didn't know how to receive help gracefully. Thank you, she whispered it against his chest that night, after the girls were asleep and the house had settled into quiet. For understanding that I need to earn this, for not just fixing everything like I'm a problem to be solved. Jamie kissed her hair, breathed in the scent that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. You can't fix people. You can only walk beside them while they fix themselves. The words felt like truth, the kind that applied to both of them equally. He couldn't fix Diana any more than she could fix him, but they could walk beside each other, could support without smothering, could love without trying to control. April brought the house in Laurelhurst. 4 bedrooms in a neighborhood where professors and doctors lived alongside professionals who'd made comfortable money without losing their souls. Not the penthouse's cold luxury, not Diana's cramped studio, but something in between. Something that felt like compromise and commitment and the cautious hope of people building a life from wreckage. They moved in on a Saturday, all four of them carrying boxes and arguing about furniture placement, and discovering that combining two households created chaos that organization couldn't contain. Emma and Sophie claimed their shared bedroom with territorial enthusiasm, covering walls with art projects and string lights and photographs that documented their friendship's rapid evolution. Diana stood in the kitchen that evening, running her hands along counters that weren't marble, but weren't cheap either. Jamie watched her face cycle through emotions he was still learning to read. It's perfect. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. First real home Sophie and I have had since Eric left. The first place that feels like ours, instead of somewhere we're just surviving. It's our home now. Jamie wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder as they looked out at the backyard that would need attention and the fence that needed painting and all the small imperfections that made a house feel lived in. All four of us. Whatever that means. Whatever it becomes. Diana turned in his embrace, kissed him with the familiarity they'd developed over 4 months of learning each other's rhythms. Whatever it becomes. I like the sound of that. May brought a different kind of challenge. Emma came home from school one afternoon with questions Jamie hadn't prepared himself to answer. Daddy, are you going to marry Diana? He looked at his daughter, 9 years old now, with birthday candles still fresh in memory, and saw Sarah's eyes looking back at him. The same directness, the same way of asking questions that cut through pretense and demanded honest answers. I don't know, sweetheart. We're taking things slowly, making sure this is right for everyone. Emma considered this with the gravity of someone twice her age. Sophie asked me the same question about you. We both think you should. Get married, I mean. Then we'd really be sisters. Jamie's throat tightened. The idea had been growing in his mind for weeks, taking shape in quiet moments when he watched Diana laugh at something one of the girls said, or caught her looking at him across a room with expression that made him feel seen in ways he hadn't since Sarah. But hearing Emma say it, hearing that Sophie shared the sentiment, transformed abstract possibility into something more concrete. Would that be okay with you? If I asked Diana to marry me? Emma's face broke into a smile that reminded him so much of Sarah it hurt. Daddy, I've been waiting for you to stop being scared and just do it. Mom would want you to be happy. She wouldn't want you to be alone forever. How do you know what Mom would want? Because she told me. Emma's voice was matter of fact, the certainty of a child who didn't question the connection between living and dead. Before she went to pick you up from the airport that day, she said she hoped you'd come home for good this time. Said she wanted us to be a real family, the three of us together every day. And then she said if anything ever happened to her, she wanted me to make sure you didn't close your heart off. Said you had a tendency to build walls when you got hurt, and I should help knock them down. Jamie couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The idea that Sarah had said those words to their daughter, that she'd somehow anticipated the possibility of her own death and tried to prepare Emma for what might come after, was almost too much to process. I never knew she said that. Knew she? Emma shrugged. I was 5. Didn't really understand what she meant until Diana showed up. But now I do. Diana knocked your walls down, Daddy. And Sophie and I want her to stay. June arrived with its longest days and Jamie's decision crystallizing into certainty. He walked into the board meeting on the 15th with resignation letter in his pocket and clarity in his mind that had been building since Christmas. Marcus Bradley's expression when Jamie announced his departure was worth more than any severance package. The combination of triumph and confusion, victory undermined by the realization that Jamie was leaving voluntarily rather than being pushed, created a satisfaction Jamie hadn't expected to feel. I'm stepping down as CEO. Harrison Security was my way of running from grief. I built this company because I didn't know what else to do with myself after my wife died. But I'm not running anymore. I have a daughter who needs a father who's present. I have a partner who deserves someone who puts her first. I have a life that matters more than quarterly projections and client acquisitions. Marcus recovered quickly, professional composure reasserting itself. This is irregular. The board should discuss. There's nothing to discuss. Jamie stood, buttoned his jacket with deliberate finality. I'm retaining my shares, attending stockholder meetings when required, available for consultation if needed. But day-to-day operations are yours now, Marcus. Congratulations on getting what you've been scheming for. I hope it makes you happy, though I suspect it won't. He walked out before anyone could respond, drove home through traffic that seemed lighter than usual, parked in the driveway of the house that had become home in ways the penthouse never had. Diana was in the kitchen preparing dinner, a task that had become shared ritual rather than individual chore. She looked up when he entered, saw something in his face, and set down the knife she'd been using. "You did it. I did it." She crossed to him, wrapped her arms around his waist, pressed her forehead against his chest in the gesture that had become their shorthand for comfort. "Are you okay?" Jamie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm terrified. I just walked away from everything I built over 3 years. Harrison's security was my identity, my purpose, the reason I got out of bed when grief made every morning feel impossible." But he paused, searching for words that matched the feeling. "But I'm also relieved. Like I've been holding my breath since Sarah died and finally remembered how to exhale." "So what happens now?" "Now we figure out who I am when I'm not CEO of anything." Jamie managed a smile that felt genuine in a way board meeting smiles never had. "Maybe start with dinner that doesn't set off the smoke alarm. Work up from there." The summer unfolded like a held breath finally released. Jamie took consulting work, security assessments, and risk management for companies that wanted his expertise without his full-time attention. Enough to contribute financially without consuming his identity, enough to matter professionally without obsessing over outcomes. He discovered he had time. Time to walk Sophie to school while Diana worked morning shifts. Time to help Emma with homework that had been outsourced to tutors during the CEO years. Time to learn his daughter's friends' names and their teachers' expectations, and all the small details of childhood that had passed in blur while he'd been building empires. The nonprofit idea came to him in July, watching Diana work a double shift because one of her colleagues had called in sick and the ER was overwhelmed with summer injuries. Single parents, he thought. People trying to raise children alone while working impossible hours and navigating systems designed for families with two incomes and two sets of hands. He mentioned it to Diana that night, tentative, still shaping the concept in his mind. What if there was a place where single parents could get help? Not charity, but resources. Counseling for people dealing with loss or divorce. Job training for those trying to rebuild careers. Legal aid for custody disputes and support enforcement. A one-stop place where someone could walk in overwhelmed and walk out with a plan. Diana's eyes lit up in a way that confirmed he was onto something real. Sarah would have loved that idea. The name came easily after that. Sarah's Haven, a memorial that did something instead of just existing, that transformed grief into purpose and loss into service. They found the storefront in September, a small space in Northeast Portland that had been a hair salon, and before that a bakery, and before that something nobody remembered. Jamie used settlement money from his Harrison security departure to fund the renovation, hired contractors who understood the vision, created a space that felt welcoming instead of institutional. Diana worked there on her days off, bringing nursing skills to a population that often couldn't afford medical attention. Emma and Sophie helped on Saturdays, organizing donated clothes and serving coffee to visitors who looked at them with something like hope. "This is what Mom wanted." Emma said it one afternoon, sorting donations with the methodical precision she'd inherited from Sarah. She used to talk about opening a place like this. Said too many people fell through cracks because nobody was there to catch them. Jamie's throat tightened with the now familiar ache of grief transformed into something else. Not the tears of fear or grief he'd seen before, but something different. Release, the kind of weeping that came when tension held too long, finally found permission to dissolve. "It's done," she kept saying it, like the words needed repetition to become real. "It's finally done. He can't hurt us anymore. Can't hurt Sophie. Can't hurt anyone." Jamie held her while she cried, felt the trembling in her shoulders gradually subside, and understood that some wounds didn't heal until the threat that caused them was truly eliminated. Miguel had been a shadow over everything they'd built, a reminder that the past could reach forward and destroy the future at any moment. Now that shadow was gone, and the future felt more solid than it had since that night at the warehouse. November brought preparations for a holiday that felt different than any since Sarah's death. Jamie found himself actually anticipating Christmas instead of dreading it, looking forward to decorations and traditions, and all the small rituals that families use to mark the passage of time. The girls insisted on choosing the tree themselves, dragging Jamie and Diana to 3 different lots before finding one that met their exacting standards. They decorated it together, all 4 of them, with ornaments that included handmade additions from Emma and Sophie, alongside the professional pieces Jamie had accumulated over years of outsourced celebration. Diana hung a star at the top, a simple silver thing she'd found at a thrift store that reminded her of one her grandmother had owned. Sophie contributed strings of popcorn that their newly adopted cat kept trying to eat. Emma added paper snowflakes she'd learned to make from a YouTube tutorial, each one slightly different, slightly imperfect, slightly perfect in its imperfection. Looking at the finished tree, Jamie felt something shift in his chest. This was what Christmas was supposed to feel like. Not expensive and coordinated and professionally arranged, but messy and personal and created together by people who cared about each other. This is the best tree we've ever had. Emma's voice was soft, almost reverent. Even better than the ones Mom used to make. It's different. Diana wrapped an arm around Emma's shoulders, pulled her close. Not better or worse, just different. Your mom's trees were beautiful because she made them with love. This one's beautiful for the same reason. Jamie watched them together, his daughter and the woman who'd crashed into his life, demanding help and stayed to become something he hadn't known he needed. Thought about the ring he'd been carrying in his pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Christmas Eve arrived with snow falling soft and steady outside windows, fogged with warmth from inside. Dinner was chaotic and delicious and slightly burnt in places, exactly the way their meals always turned out despite improving skills. The girls disappeared after dessert, sugar high and conspiratorial, leaving adults alone with wine and firelight, and the tree glowing in the corner. "Can I talk to you about something?" Diana's voice was soft, almost nervous. Jamie set down his glass, gave her his full attention. "I've been thinking about us, about what we're building here, about where this is going." Diana took a breath, the kind that preceded difficult truths. "And I realize I don't want to keep waiting for disaster. Don't want to spend another year wondering if this is real or just 2 broken people clinging to each other because we're scared of being alone." Jamie's chest tightened. Are you saying you want to end things?" "God, no." Diana laughed, the sound wet with tears that were suddenly appearing on her cheeks. "I'm saying I want to stop being careful. I want to commit to this, fully, completely, without the escape routes we've both been maintaining. I want to be your partner in everything, not just the easy parts." The words unlocked something Jamie hadn't realized he'd been holding back. He'd been careful too, protecting himself from potential loss by never fully believing this could last. But Diana was right. Careful wasn't living. Careful was just fear wearing sensible clothes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the ring he'd been carrying since that day in the jewelry store, when he'd seen it and known immediately that it belonged on Diana's hand. The diamond was modest, nothing ostentatious, but the band was platinum and meant to last. "Diana Chen," Jamie's voice cracked on her name, emotion breaking through carefully maintained composure. "You saved my life the night you knocked on my door, not just from loneliness or grief, though you did that too. You saved me from becoming the kind of man who builds walls so high he forgets there's a world outside them, who mistakes success for meaning, who forgets that the only things worth having are the ones that can be lost." Diana was crying openly now, tears streaming down cheeks Jamie had learned to love, had learned to trust with parts of himself he'd kept hidden from everyone since Sarah's funeral. "Will you marry me?" "Yes." The word came out strangled, half laugh and half sob. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." The girls burst through the door then, faces pressed to the crack that had been their observation post. They'd been eavesdropping, obviously, and their attempt at surprise was unconvincing. Emma was screaming something about finally, and Sophie was demanding to see the ring, and suddenly there were 4 people hugging in a pile on the living room floor, laughing and crying and celebrating in the way that only families could. Later, after the girls had been convinced to actually sleep and the house had settled into quiet, Jamie stood at the window watching snow accumulate on branches and rooftops and the world outside their warm cocoon. Diana came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and they watched the white flakes drift down together. "What are you thinking about, Sarah?" Jamie said it without guilt, because Diana understood, wondering if she'd approve of all this, of us. Diana's arms tightened around him. "She'd be proud of you, for letting go, for moving forward, for showing Emma that love doesn't end when people die. It just transforms into something different. Jamie turned in her embrace, looked at this woman who'd come to him desperate and afraid and stayed to become everything. I never thought I'd feel this way again. That certainty that someone sees all of you, the good and the terrible, and chooses to stay anyway. Sarah had that. Losing it felt like losing the possibility of ever having it again. Diana reached up, touched his face, traced the lines that grief and time had carved around his eyes. Maybe what we have isn't the same as what you had with Sarah. Maybe it's something new. Something that only exists because of everything we both went through to get here. Her voice was steady, certain in a way that came from hard-won wisdom. I don't want to replace Sarah. I want to honor her by proving that the love she taught you about isn't gone. It just found a new place to live. Jamie kissed her, long and deep, tasting salt from tears and wine and the future they were building together. Outside, Portland slept under December snow. Somewhere, Miguel Herrera sat in a cell waiting for justice that would be slow and thorough. Somewhere, Marcus Bradley was discovering that power wasn't the same as happiness. Somewhere, other families were struggling, other single parents were drowning, other children were waiting for someone to save them. But here, in this house that smelled like Christmas cookies and possibility, Jamie Harrison finally understood what Sarah had been trying to teach him all along. We save people not through grand gestures or heroic violence, but through the daily choice to show up, through the willingness to be present even when presence is hard, through the courage to love again after loss has taught you exactly how much loving can cost. Diana, Emma, Sophie, the family they'd built from wreckage and stubbornness and the refusal to let fear win. Worth everything, all of it. The wedding came in spring, a small ceremony at Sarah's Haven that felt appropriate for everything it represented. 50 guests gathered in the space Jamie had built to honor one love and now used to celebrate another. Emma served as maid of honor, taking the responsibility with gravity that made Diana cry. Sophie was flower girl, scattering petals with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found solid ground after years of uncertainty. Jamie's vows were simple, the words coming from somewhere deeper than rehearsal. I spent 3 years building walls to protect myself from ever feeling loss again. You showed up at my door one night and knocked every single one of them down. Not with force, but with need that I couldn't refuse to answer. You taught me that being human means risking hurt, that love isn't love unless it can be lost, that the only life worth living is one shared with people brave enough to stay. I promise to walk beside you through whatever comes, not to fix you because you don't need fixing, just to be there every day, choosing you over and over until choosing becomes as natural as breathing. Diana's vows matched his in simplicity and exceeded them in the way her voice broke on every other word. I came to you desperate and broken and certain that no one would help because that's what experience had taught me about the world. You proved experience wrong. You showed me that good men exist, that help doesn't always come with strings attached, that sometimes the universe sends exactly what you need at exactly the moment you need it. I promise to be your partner in everything, the hard parts and the easy parts and all the messy bits in between. I promise to keep choosing you, even when choosing is scary, because being scared with you is better than being safe alone. The reception spilled out into the evening. Guests mingling in spaces designed for counseling and support, but transformed for one night into celebration. Jamie watched Diana dance with Sophie, watched Emma teach one of his former SEAL teammates how to do the Macarena, watched the two threads of his life weaving together into something stronger than either had been alone. Marcus Bradley showed up near the end, unexpected and clearly uncomfortable. Jamie found him standing near the exit, looking like someone who'd walked into the wrong party. I wanted to say congratulations. Marcus's voice was stilted, formal, missing the predatory confidence Jamie had come to expect. And to apologize for the way I handled things during your transition, for prioritizing the company over your well-being. Jamie studied the man who'd been his nemesis for months, who'd schemed for his removal, who'd treated his relationship with Diana as liability rather than asset. Why are you really here, Marcus? Because the company is failing without you. Marcus's composure cracked, revealing exhaustion and something that might have been humility. Stock down 20% since you left. 3 major clients defected. Employee turnover at an all-time high. Everything I thought I wanted, everything I maneuvered for, is turning to dust. And you think telling me this will make me come back? No, Marcus shook his head. I think telling you this is what I owe you, an acknowledgement that I was wrong. You weren't distracted or unstable. You were human, building a company while also being a father and falling in love and dealing with real problems. I thought that was weakness. Turns out it was the source of everything that made Harrison's security work. Jamie considered gloating, considered delivering the vindication Marcus's confession deserved. Decided it wasn't worth the effort on his wedding day. The company will survive or it won't. That's not my concern anymore. But Marcus, if you want some advice from someone who learned the hard way, find something that matters to you beyond shareholder value. Otherwise, you'll wake up at 60 and realize you traded your entire life for a stock price. Marcus nodded, turned to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, your wife seems wonderful, both of them, Diana and Sarah. You're a lucky man, Jamie Harrison. He was gone before Jamie could respond, disappearing into the evening and leaving behind only the faint impression that even people you thought you knew completely could still surprise you. Diana found him a few minutes later, concern in her expression. Everything okay? Who was that? Marcus Bradley. Came to apologize and acknowledge that destroying my career didn't make him happy. Diana wrapped her arms around him, pressed close in the way that had become their default position for comfort. How do you feel about that? Jamie considered the question seriously. I feel like people are capable of change, even people you've written off. And I feel grateful that I changed when I did, before I became someone who couldn't. The first year of marriage passed faster than Jamie expected, time accelerating now that it was filled with content that mattered. Sarah's Haven grew from struggling nonprofit into genuine community resource, helping over 200 single parents navigate crises that range from housing insecurity to custody disputes to the simple, crushing exhaustion of trying to do alone what was meant to be done together. Diana continued nursing, though she'd cut back to part-time to spend more hours at the Haven. Her medical knowledge proved invaluable for clients who couldn't afford doctor visits, who needed someone to explain symptoms and sort through the healthcare system's Byzantine requirements. Emma turned 10, then 11, transforming from little girl into something that looked increasingly like young woman. She'd started calling Diana Mom sometime during their first summer in the Laurelhurst house, the word emerging naturally during a conversation about homework and sticking, because it fit. Sophie's nightmares faded to occasional disturbances rather than nightly terrors. She'd started calling Jamie Dad around the same time Emma started calling Diana Mom, the symmetry feeling like something the universe had arranged rather than anything humans had planned. They became a family not through ceremony or legal documents, but through the accumulation of small moments. Breakfast arguments about who finished the cereal, movie nights where someone always fell asleep before the ending, holidays that mixed traditions from before with new ones they created together. Jamie found himself thinking about Sarah less often, which he'd expected to feel like betrayal, but instead felt like healing. She remained present in Emma's eyes, in certain phrases Diana used without knowing their origin, in the philosophy that guided Sarah's Haven. But the grief had transformed from sharp pain into gentle ache, from wound into scar that reminded without crippling. The second anniversary of the warehouse came and went without fanfare. Jamie noticed the date, acknowledged it internally, and chose not to mention it to anyone. Some memories were meant to be carried privately, honored through living well rather than dwelling on what had almost destroyed everything. Miguel Herrera's trial concluded that same month, guilty verdicts on 17 counts, resulting in consecutive sentences that would keep him imprisoned until long after everyone involved had forgotten why it mattered. Agent Torres called with the news, professional satisfaction evident in his voice. It's done, justice served. You and your family can stop looking over your shoulders. Jamie thanked him, hung up the phone, and felt the last weight he'd been carrying finally lift from his shoulders. The past was truly past now. The future was everything that remained. Christmas arrived again, the second one in the Laurelhurst house, and this time the preparations carried none of the uncertainty that had marked the year before. The girls decorated with practiced efficiency, arguing about ornament placement with the comfortable familiarity of siblings who'd been together forever. Diana baked cookies that only slightly burned around the edges. Jamie found himself actually singing carols while helping with dishes, something he hadn't done since before Sarah's death. Christmas morning brought presents and chaos and the particular joy of children who still believed in magic even if they'd stopped believing in Santa. Jamie watched his daughters tear through wrapping paper, watched his wife photograph the destruction with her phone, and felt gratitude so overwhelming it threatened to stop his heart. This, he thought, this is what survival looks like. Not the absence of loss, but the presence of new love, growing in the spaces lost left behind. Not forgetting what came before, but building something new from its foundation. Diana caught his eye across the room, smiled in the way that meant she knew exactly what he was thinking. Mouthed the words, "I love you," over the heads of their daughters, their presence a reminder that family was a choice made new every day. Later, after the excitement had faded and the girls had retreated to their room to play with new acquisitions, Jamie found himself standing at the window watching snow fall on Portland. Diana joined him, fitting herself under his arm in the position that had become their default for moments like these. "What are you thinking about?" Jamie considered the question, searched for words that matched the feeling. "I'm thinking about how close I came to missing all of this. How easily I could have closed my door that night and stayed safe behind my walls. How much I would have lost by protecting myself from risk." Diana was quiet for a moment, snow reflecting off her face in patterns that made her look almost ethereal. "Do you regret it, any of it?" Jamie thought about the warehouse, the gunfire, the shrapnel in his shoulder that still ached when weather changed. Thought about Miguel's threats and Marcus's schemes and all the ways the last 2 years had tested him. Not 1 second, every bit of pain was worth it to end up here, with you, with them. He gestured toward the room where their daughter's laughter filtered through closed doors. "I'd do it all again, every time." Diana reached up, touched his face, traced the lines that time and joy and sorrow had carved around his eyes. "That's what love is, isn't it? The willingness to walk through fire because someone on the other side is worth reaching." Jamie pulled her close, held her against the cold window and the warm room and everything they'd built, from wreckage and determination. "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." Outside, Portland settled into the quiet of Christmas night. Snow continued falling, covering the city in white, transforming the familiar into something magical. Inside the Laurelhurst house, 4 people created their own warmth, their own light, their own small corner of the universe, where love had won over fear and family had emerged from the ashes of what came before. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Fairy tales didn't include nightmares that lingered or scars that ached or the hard work of choosing each other every single day. But it was real, which was better. It was earned, which made it precious. It was theirs, which made it everything. Jamie Harrison had spent 15 years learning to be a weapon, 3 years trying to forget how, and 2 years discovering that the most powerful thing a person could do wasn't destroy enemies, but build a life worth protecting. Diana shifted in his arms, looked up at him with eyes that held their entire history and their entire future in equal measure. "Happy Christmas, Jamie. Happy Christmas, Diana." The snow kept falling, the children kept laughing, and somewhere in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, Sarah Harrison watched over the family her death had eventually made possible, approving of choices her husband had finally found the courage to make. Because that's what love did. Not end when people died, but transform into something new. Something that honored what was lost by embracing what remained. Something worth saving, something worth fighting for. Something worth every single sacrifice that had brought them here. To this moment, to this house, to this life that looked nothing like the one Jamie had planned, and everything like the one he'd needed all along.